Darren leads a normal life. He is popular among his classmates, excels academically, pleases his parents, and has many friends. However, his best friend, Steve, doesn't quite fit into this regular life. Steve invites Darren to skip history class, and Darren reluctantly agrees. Steve then dares Darren to break a school lantern, resulting in Darren getting scolded by both his teacher and parents. At home, Darren's mother is desperate, scolding him harshly and forbidding him from being friends with Steve. His father also believes Steve is a bad influence. To his parents, the ideal path for Darren involves a good college, a stable job, and starting his own family. Though he knows he doesn't want to live this way, he doesn't argue with his parents. The next day, Darren tells Steve that their friendship must now remain a secret to avoid angering his parents. Steve is furious, accusing Darren of being weak. Their argument is interrupted by the arrival of an old car with the word "Destiny" on its license plate. An unknown man throws a flyer out the window, which lands at Darren's feet. The flyer is an invitation to a freak circus performance. The friends want to attend, but Darren is grounded for 2 months. Nevertheless, that evening, Darren sneaks out to join Steve at the circus. They arrive at an old theater and notice a blood-red moon hanging in the sky. They buy tickets from a strange little man and enter the hall. The show begins. The host, with his large, unusually shaped head, introduces the Wolfman as the first act. With a roar, the Wolfman approaches a woman in the audience and bites off her arm. She screams, and the audience panics. However, moments later, the woman steps onto the stage and her arm regrows. She is the queen of regeneration. Next comes the skeletal Alexander, who lacks skin and internal organs in his abdomen. Other acts include a woman with huge teeth and a man with 2 stomachs who can digest anything. Following them is Evra, a boy with snakeskin, and the final act, a striking woman named Madame Truska. She invites Darren on stage as her assistant. Upon touching him, she grows a beard, much to the crowd's delight. Looking into Darren's eyes, Madame Truska senses that something ominous is in his future. The next performer is a magician named Larton Crepsley and his spider, Madame Octa. Crepsley flies onto the stage, and Darren is mesmerized by the deadly spider, which Crepsley controls with his flute. The spider lands on Darren's leg. Crepsley retrieves the spider and warns that if anyone knew about vampires, they would be strangled in their sleep by one. Suddenly, a group of protesters bursts into the hall, fighting against the freaks. Darren uses the chaos to sneak backstage, where he finds Crepsley's dressing room. Entranced by Madame Octa, he admires the spider and plays the flute for her. Just then, voices are heard outside. Darren hides in the closet as Crepsley and another vampire, Gavner, enter. From their conversation, Darren learns that vampires are being hunted by their enemies, the brutal Vampanese. They also mention the return of the mysterious Mr. Tiny, who seeks to destroy the vampires. Steve barges into the room, demanding that Crepsley turn him into a vampire. Crepsley refuses, stating that Steve's blood is bad and unsuitable for vampirism. Furious, Steve threatens violence, but the vampires quickly throw him out. Once alone, Crepsley realizes that Darren has stolen Madame Octa. Darren escapes, but Crepsley witnesses him being picked up by a car driven by Mr. Tiny and a Vampanese. Tiny offers Darren a place in their group, but the boy jumps out near his house and runs away. At school the next day, Darren reveals the stolen spider to Steve, who realizes Darren overheard the vampire's conversation. During recess, Steve accidentally drops the spider's cage, freeing Madame Octa. The hall fills with students as the deadly spider scurries across the floor. Steve, armed with a broom, tries to kill her, but Darren attempts to protect the spider. Sensing danger, Madame Octa bites Steve on the cheek, and he collapses. Desperate to save his friend, Darren goes to Crepsley for an antidote. Crepsley refuses to help unless Darren agrees to become his half-vampire assistant in exchange for the antidote and protection from Mr. Tiny. Though reluctant, Darren agrees to save Steve. After a blood exchange ceremony, Darren becomes a half-vampire. Together, he and Crepsley rush to the hospital to administer the antidote, saving Steve's life. As Steve recovers and returns to school, Darren begins to crave raw meat and blood, nearly attacking his sister. Crepsley urges Darren to leave his family, suggesting they stage his death. After a tearful goodbye to his family, Crepsley distracts Darren and snaps his neck, rendering him immobile, but alive. To complete the ruse, Crepsley throws Darren off a roof. Everyone believes Darren is dead, and during the funeral, Steve places a phone in Darren's coffin, noticing his vampire claws. Steve now sees Darren as a traitor. That night, Crepsley digs up Darren's grave, only for them to be ambushed by a Vampanese named Merlot. After a fierce fight in the cemetery, Crepsley and Darren narrowly escape. Crepsley takes Darren to the Freak Circus, where the ringmaster, Mr. Tall, agrees to shelter him. Darren meets a girl named Rebecca, and the two grow closer. Darren will share a tent with a guy named Evra, who has snake-like skin. Meanwhile, Steve continues attending school. Unable to forget Darren, he contemplates suicide, but at the last moment, Tiny intervenes. Tiny reveals that Darren is still alive, but has become a vampire, betraying Steve. During a conversation with Toll and Crepsley, he announces the imminent start of a war between vampires and Vampanese. According to a prophecy, 2 young men will lead the conflict. Tiny demands that Darren be handed over to him, but Toll asks for time to consider. The next day, Darren and Rebecca grow closer, with Rebecca confiding in him that she is a monkey girl with a tail. Darren is not bothered by this revelation. That evening, Crepsley begins teaching Darren how to fight as a vampire, understanding the dangers that loom ahead. However, Darren lacks the strength because he still refuses to drink blood, and Crepsley plans to remedy this. Meanwhile, the Vampanese initiate Steve into their ranks in a brutal rite of passage, which Steve successfully completes. His first victim as a Vampanese is his high school history teacher. Crepsley explains to Darren that there is no need to kill humans. Vampires can put their victims to sleep with their breath, take a little blood, and leave them alive. The victims will wake up none the wiser. This, he says, is the fundamental difference between vampires and Vampanese. Despite this, Darren still refuses to drink blood. That night, the Vampanese raid the Freak camp, searching everywhere for Darren. The boy is too weak to defend himself, but Crepsley comes to his aid, hiding him in a coffin. The Freaks manage to drive the Vampanese away, but they kidnap Rebecca, telling Darren that he should return home. In the evening, Darren finds himself back in his old home, but it's empty. Tiny and Steve have kidnapped Darren's family. Darren realizes that his relatives are being held in the old theater where the circus once performed. At the theater, Murloc confronts Darren. His family and Rebecca are tied up and suspended over the stage. Steve soon arrives and starts bragging about the people he's killed and the thrill it brings him. Steve offers Darren a choice. If Darren kills Rebecca and drinks her blood, his family will go free. Darren will also be required to join the Vampanese. Darren firmly refuses, but he's still too weak to fight, as he hasn't drunk any blood. Just then, Crepsley arrives at the theater, engaging in a fierce battle with Murloc while Mr. Tiny watches, entertained but uninvolved. With her tail, Rebecca manages to free herself and rushes to Darren. She urges him to drink some of her blood, but Darren fears he'll lose his humanity if he does. Rebecca convinces him to take the plunge, and Darren finally drinks her blood. The battle between Crepsley and Murloc intensifies, becoming increasingly brutal. Steve soon joins the fight, stabbing Crepsley with a silver knife. Just then, Darren, now empowered by the blood he's consumed, emerges and attacks Steve. In the chaos, Crepsley seizes the opportunity, pulling out a knife and plunging it into Murlock's heart. He ominously declares that the war is now inevitable. Mr. Tiny thanks everyone for their part in what he views as a performance. However, Darren believes that the war can be averted if no one learns of what transpired. Determined, he engages in a fight with Steve. With a simple gesture, Tiny separates them, stating that it's not yet time for their final showdown. According to prophecy, that decisive battle will happen later. Darren offers Steve one last chance to turn away from the darkness, but Steve refuses. Afterward, Tiny drains the soul from Murlock's body, leaving it small, shriveled, and yet still alive. Tiny and Steve then leave to join the Vampanese. Crepsley hypnotizes Darren's parents, erasing their memories of the night's events. As they leave the house, Darren finally shares a long-awaited kiss with Rebecca, something he had dreamed about for so long. The friends return to the Freak camp, where the majority votes to let Darren stay. However, Gavner soon visits Crepsley, informing him that it's time for the three of them to leave and join the vampires. Unaware of this, Darren remains content, happy with how everything has turned out. If you enjoy it, click and subscribe and watch the next video.